Thank you. Thank you. All right. So today we're going to be talking about a web framework called Express. Express is a framework that is linked to Node.js in the sense that we use it because it gives us a bunch of feature that can make creating a server way easier than what it would be if we didn't have it. How do we install it? Well, as I mentioned in the previous lesson, whenever we use Node, we use a Node package manager called npm. And what we do is we just write on our terminal in the directory of our project, npm install Express. We'll go, we'll look into it later today. Now, whenever we work with Express, we are using templates. Why? Because since we're working with requests and responses, many times we want to generate, for instance, a user page. And whenever we're creating a user page, we're accessing a database that retrieves info about this user. Now, if we're using this info in the web page, there has to be a way for us to generalize a template for our user web page so that it's different for every single user based on the data that we retrieve. To do this, we use a templating engine called Jade. It is very simple and it's very similar to HTML, so I'm pretty sure you guys can get the gist of it very quickly. So what is an Express server composed of? An Express server is composed of a series of endpoints, meaning a series of specific targets where we can make requests, and we can also define very specific requests, meaning that based on the data that we want to retrieve, based on whether we want to send data to the server or retrieve data to the server, we're going to be using different requests. In specific, the first one that we're going to be using is a GET request. A GET request is made every time we press return, the moment we put a URL in our browser. It is, in fact, the most common one because it is the one that can basically retrieve an HTML page and so on. So if we have to retrieve data, many times we use GET. Whenever we have something that we have to submit to the server, then we use a POST request. A POST request cannot be made by the URL bar from our browser, and that's because sometimes we are inputting secure data to the server. And in order for us to do this, we have to use a console, we have to use JavaScript. There are many ways to do this. In Node.js, we consider route every single endpoint where we make a request. So if we had, for instance, the home page of our server, which is the one that retrieves an HTML page, we will use a GET request. Again, we make GET requests every time we paste a URL in our browser. Now, if we wanted to retrieve a piece of HTML from a website, we would use a GET request, and that's because, of course, we are getting something from the server. We are not giving something to the server. As opposed to having, for instance, a form in our login form that will send data to the server, then in that case, we will use a POST request. Now, today we're going to be looking at 4 things. The first one, we're going to look at a boilerplate of what an Express project looks like, because it's very complex and there are very specific things that we have to look at before being able to create our endpoints, which is going to be our second point for today, meaning we're going to create our first server using Express. Last time we saw how to create a simple server using Node.js. With Express we have way more features, and that's why I wanted to show you guys today. Of course, we're going to understand why a GET and POST requests are different and how we can declare them in Express so that it is defined what kind of requests we're working with. Last but not least, we're going to host our HTML using Express, as we did for Node.js. And what you guys are going to see is that the process is way simpler. Okay, before looking at the next lecture, let's get into it. So a good thing about rep.it, since you guys cannot modify those computers, is that it already includes a template for Express. So if I just press Express here, it's going to create a boilerplate with everything that I need to start my server. So, whoops. .output. Okay. Express. Interesting. Let me log in real quick. Actually, I think that we can use my. Okay, so this is a simple server using the very basics of it. Now, the first var requires the module express, which we have installed running this command. If we want to save it into our Node.js project, we just have to include save. So it would be save express. And so on. So for every module that we're going to install, whenever we run npm install in our server, it's going to install whatever it's in this package JSON. As you can see, in dependencies, I have only Express, Body Parser, and SQLite. We're not going to need this because this one is actually related to a database. Body Parser is actually necessary for us to run our requests and our responses. So the first variable basically requires the module Express. It is the web framework itself. And then later on, we declare an application using Express brackets. And what this does, it creates an instance of the web framework that we can then use to make our first server online, set up our first server so that everybody can see it. Now, whenever you guys see a required, it means that we're using a module. In this case, Body Parser is a middleware, meaning something that we put in the middle between our server and our client that allows us to have some features, some additional features. In this case, Body Parser allows us to parse our responses into JSON easily, because usually it's a string, and then using this middleware, we're able to understand that that string is actually an object, and that object can be accessed using JavaScript and Node.js. In this case, we are specifically using JSON, which is the standard format, the standard markup for responses in Node.js. It is being used in many languages. Python uses it. I believe Ruby uses it too. Most of the most famous web frameworks implement JSON. What does JSON look like? Well, JSON is just a JavaScript object notation. Let me see if I can find a more clear example. Okay, so this is a good example. We start with the curly braces, and then we define something, and then we open the curly braces, and then we have an object and its value, an object and its value, an object and its value. So it kind of just juxtapose the title of an object with the actual value of the object. If we wanted then to access the value of the object, we would have to do object.value, if it makes sense. And so we start from the biggest value, which is in this case glossary, and then if we want to access, for instance, glossdiv, we would have to do glossary.title.glossdiv. Sorry, glossary.glossdiv, because title is at the same level of glossdiv. It's just another point because it's separated by the comma. Let's go back to our server. Okay, so this is not really important. It just says that we're only accepting specific URLs when it comes to requests. It's just a format for us to accept requests that are actually useful, because sometimes, of course, we could run scripts, and some people could try to make requests that are not allowed. This is just a specific term to allow only good requests, requests that have a header, requests that are good for our server. This other term, oh, and by the way, every time you guys see app.use, it means that it's using a middleware. It means that it's using a feature that is that we are running in the middle of our server. So for instance, in here, we're using JSON for our whole experience in our server. In here, we're using this type of URLs because it is in the middle of our server. In here, we're telling Express that whenever it comes to our static resources, we're referring to a directory that is public. I deleted it because we're not actually doing anything in this example, but if we wanted to, for instance, render an image or an HTML page that doesn't require any additional value, then we'd have to access a static resource, and we do that by using express.static. Now we get to the interesting part. This app.get defines a GET request so that whenever I access this URL of my server, then this response will be sent. In specific, we have two parameters in our function, request and response. So for instance, if we're doing, whenever we run a Node.js server, it's always as default to this port. And then this would be the beginning point of our server. If we wanted to define this one as being hello, it would be this endpoint. So it really depends on what you guys want to do. If you're defining a web page and this is the entry point of our web page, meaning this is where you're hosting your primary HTML page, then yes, this would be the best endpoint for you. But if you're defining an API, you might need to have something like this, because we want to just access the users, or we want to retrieve a URL, or we want to retrieve some chores. This was just a simple server that I created for my app. So again, this thing defines a GET request. As you can see in my reference, if you just want to define a POST request, this is the syntax. Of course, the main difference is that we cannot make POST requests from this bar, meaning that we cannot say if this was a POST request and this was hello, we wouldn't be able to do. It wouldn't be possible to do this because this is just a GET request. Every time we call a URL using the browser bar, we're asking for a GET request. Whenever we need a POST request, what we do is we use scripts that allows us to do so. For instance, if we wanted to make a POST request to the server, there's a very useful framework called Jquery, and Jquery has something called Ajax, and what it does, it basically defines, it basically defines a POST request. We can make whatever kind of request from Jquery, but I just wanted to show you guys how a format for how we can set it up for a POST request, and this is the terminology. So what you basically do whenever you want to work with this is you include the script for Jquery that you can find on their website, and then this is the way we make a POST request. So for instance, if we had an HTML web page and we wanted to submit whatever login info to the server, then we would have to call Jquery with this. In data, we would have to create a JSON object containing the data of the user. The way we define endpoints is by, for instance, creating a bunch of app.post or get. There are other types of requests, but for this lesson, I just wanted to stop with get and post. So for instance, in here we can have homepage, or actually just this one, and then we could have, and so on, or send login info. Okay. Now, an important thing about this is that, as I mentioned the previous time, we need to end our requests, end our responses every time. Otherwise, it would run forever. You know, when I refresh the page, well, that would run forever if we don't end our responses. We can end them in many ways. The most simple one is to send something in return. So in here, we could say, welcome to our website. In here, we could say, there are no users for now, and that's because we haven't implemented a database yet. And then in here we can say login info. If we run this, it will, in repl.it, the useful thing is that it will always be at this URL. So no matter what happens, this will be here, okay? And then, again, if we wanted to display users, we would just have to call display users. So you kind of understand the flow of a server. We have a bunch of endpoints, and depending on what we have to do with our server, whether retrieve data from the user or send data to the user, we use different requests and, of course, different endpoints. In Python, it is actually possible to set up an endpoint so that it handles both get and post requests. In Node.js, this is a little bit more strict. We have to stick with either a get request or a post request when it comes to express.js. Last but not least, we are using @listen in order for us to set up our server. The moment, if we didn't have this here, it would return an error, I think. Or at least it wouldn't display it. And in fact, it doesn't display it. And that's because whenever we say listen, we tell the computer, okay, now that I defined my endpoints, just set it up at this port. So whenever we access websites, we don't actually see the port, but whenever we have our local host, many times when we are developing, we're working on a specific port. And that's because whenever you set up a server locally, it sets up on localhost. And so, of course, if we were to run 10 servers, it would not work because that specific port is already used. So in order for us to be able to run more things, we are using a specific port, which in this case is set up as default as being 3000. Why is this important? Because sometimes you're not only dealing with a server, you're dealing with a series of applications, meaning that, let's make an example. It would be very hard for us to develop machine learning in JavaScript. So we could use Python to develop our machine learning algorithm and then send something in return. Now, of course, JavaScript could be easier to implement when it comes to web developing. So what we could do is get something from our Python endpoint and then put it on our JavaScript API, and then from the JavaScript API, send it to our client. Now, those three things are three different apps. They're hosted on different ports. In reality, what we would do is host them on the same platform using different URLs. And for this, there are many tools. The one that I usually use is Heroku because it's free. We're going to be using it to deploy your first server. I didn't want to get this far because I understand that the concept of endpoints could be a little bit more cryptic at first. Okay, let's get back here. And of course, we can console log using this one. Now, of course, as I said before, if we were to render an HTML page, we wouldn't find the logs here because these are just the logs of our server. Hypothetically speaking, every server is just a machine that runs this code. So in theory, if you were to get your general IP address, you could show people your server using your specific machine. Now, of course, this is not recommended because this is your computer, and what we usually do is use computers that are way more powerful and that can handle more data so that our server doesn't crash. Okay, let's look at another example. This one implements an actual HTML page in it. And it's right here. So in here, I am defining a few more things, and that is a folder public where I have my index.jade. Now, in order for me to render it, I am still using a GET request, but I am rendering it using rest.render, and I am accessing this directory, and I am setting a title, TechLab. So if I run it, as you can see, first of all, it installs all the dependencies from package.json. Package.json is basically the basic entry point from where you run npm install, and then what it does is it looks at all the dependencies that you have, and then it installs it, so you can use your server. Now, This is the same HTML page that we have been using for the whole TechLab. And as you can see, it is not HTML. So this is what I was talking about in my presentation. This is Jade. It is a way for us to define a template so that if we wanted to define variables that would change every time we retrieve different data, it would work. With simple HTML, that's not possible. There are other frameworks that allow us to do that and that can actually work a little better than this. Problem is that this is a little simpler than more accurate frameworks. The most famous being React. It is a tool created by Facebook, and it is kind of the framework that won over other component frameworks. What it does is it takes all these HTML components, all these HTML tags, and it kind of like bottles them up in components so that you will have your header, you will have your category, I'm a student at Pasadena City College, and so of course the developing becomes more like applying those components in your HTML page rather than just rendering a static website. When it comes to Jade, we're defining the same tags, but indentation is important. So as much as we're using indentation in Python, in here we have to specify that HTML encloses head encloses meta, since we don't have closing tags. We just have entry points for our tags. A very useful resource, since I honestly don't even remember this markup, is just to use HTML to Jade. It is just a template that allows us to get something like let's go to PCC website, and then if we wanted to pick a specific tag like this one, I'll copy it, and then this is the HTML, and this is the Jade. As you can see, it's a little bit different, and of course, it would be a little bit cryptic to kind of like understand it at first. So what we usually do is we create our front end, meaning our HTML markup, and then we just put it here, get the Jade, and plug it into our file. These are not part of this lesson. It is just a definition of the database. We'll be covering this in the next lesson. At the same time, package.lock is created the moment we install our dependencies that are found here. And what happens locally is whenever we run npm install, we create a folder called not modules in our directory of our project, where it contains every single reference that is requested to run our server. Okay, I believe this is pretty much it for today. Next time, what I would like to do is to consider a project, understand how a server works, try to define a few endpoints beforehand, and then show it to you guys so that you understand the basic flow of a web app. And then from there, we'll try to implement our first database, which allows us to actually save our data somewhere. Because the problem with many platforms, for instance, Heroku, is that, of course, sometimes they go to sleep, like this one. For instance, this is the free plan, and of course, at some point, the machine turns off. And so, of course, if we start saving our data on our machine, we'll end up losing it. So what we do is we define another entity, which is a database that we refer to just for our data. For instance, if we need like users, then we would store like what that user's name is, or what his score of followers is. We're gonna be using a tool called MongoLab, and which refers to MongoDB, which is the database that we're gonna be using. And the cool thing about this is that it uses JSON. So whenever you see like JSON being retrieved from responses or JSON being sent out from a request, it is actually the same exact template. Okay, so the takeaway project for today would be to create a basic server with 4 endpoints. 2 of them will redirect you to an URL of your choice, and this implements a method that was not specified by me in my lessons. So there is actually a method that you can find in the documentation of Express, and that can actually redirect you from your server to another server, which in this case could be a website. It could be anything that you want. And the other 2 will actually render to HTML pages. So this is just a simple exercise for you to understand a little bit more how the documentation of Express works, meaning how many things you can do with Express as opposed to simple Node.js, and then how to render simple HTML pages using that. It is just a more advanced version of the simple HTTP module of Node.js, but it allows us to do way, way more. Okay, let me know if you have any question. Thank you, everybody, and I'll see you next time. Just take a snapshot.